Hey, it's good to be with you today for our devotion. That's part of our Bible reading plan. We are in the 14th chapter of the book of Acts. And, chapters 13 and 14 describe Paul and Barnabas, what's normally called Paul's first missionary journey. They were commissioned, as you remember, in the beginning of chapter 13, verse 1 and following, commissioned or sent out by the church in Antioch. And they traveled to the island and then up to parts of Turkey and so on. And you may have picked up in chapters 13 and 14 that one of the cities they preached the gospel in and planted a new church in was also called Antioch. I think in one place, Pisidian Antioch. And that can be a little confusing for you if you don't pay attention. What you have here are two different cities. So you had the city of Antioch, where the church was that sent them out, located in at that time Syria, and Antioch was one of the major cities of that part of the world in the first century. Very cosmopolitan city, a wealthy city, and so they were sent out from that Antioch. Today, that Antioch, the ruins of it and the city that's grew around it, is located in kind of the southern tip of Turkey that dips down to the border of Syria. But at this time, it was a major city in Syria. Antioch, that they visited in chapters 13 and 14, is a city over in what was Galatia then, part of modern Turkey. So two different cities, like you have Lexington, Kentucky, Lexington, South Carolina, Lexington, North Carolina, 25 Lexingtons in America. So you have multiple Antiochs. So don't let that confuse you when you read that. Now, what spoke to me in chapter 14 is the faithfulness of Paul and Barnabas to keep sharing the gospel in the face of severe opposition, antagonism, persecution, you name it, they experienced it. In chapter 14, starting at verse 1, says, in Iconium, this is after they had left Antioch, Pisidian Antioch, in Iconium, they entered the synagogue of the Jews together and spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both Jews and Gentiles or Greeks, because there were what you would think of as what were called God-fearers, Gentiles who would go to the Jewish synagogue to worship because they had respect for the religion and even believed in monotheism. They weren't circumcised and therefore became full proselytes to Judaism, but they feared the God of Israel. And so these God-fearing Greeks or Gentiles, along with some of the Jews in Iconium in the synagogue, become believers in Jesus. Verse 2, but the Jews who disbelieved, the Jews who refused to accept Christ as the Messiah, stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren. And so they created a controversy, if you will. Verse 3, therefore they spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord, and God was doing great things. So what intrigued me when I read that was they go to this synagogue in Iconium and people get saved. So it starts off great. Then there's controversy and bitterness stirred up against them and the gospel they were preaching. What did they do? They didn't back down. They didn't become silent. They kept preaching. Notice what he says in verse 3. They spent a long time there speaking boldly. So they didn't allow the opposition and the bitterness on the part of some of the Jews to stop them from talking about Jesus. Now the story continues in verse 4. In time, the people of the city became divided. Some sided with the Jews, some sided with the apostles. The apostles are Barnabas and Paul, down in verse 14. Verse 5. And when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers, in other words, they got the community leaders, the city leaders, the government officials, the synagogue officials, others on their side, they decided to mistreat them and to stone them. And verse 6, they became aware, Paul and Barnabas became aware of it, and they fled to the city of Lycaonia, Lystra, Derbe, and the surrounding regions. So they stayed there a long time in the face of opposition, but when it got to the point that they might be killed, they left. The church was still there and was growing. But they left, and in verse 7, they kept preaching the gospel to all these new places they went. And I was reading that, and I was thinking about how those who didn't like the message of Jesus being the Messiah got the rest of the community, the powers that be, the influential people, the decision makers on their side, and rallied the masses against Paul and Barnabas and this new church, these new believers. And it just got me thinking about how easy it is to stir up a crowd, especially with anger or hatred or negativity. So easy to stir up a crowd in that way. So they eventually make their way to another city, another town called Lystra, and there they heal a lame man, and at first the crowds are blown away and want to worship them as gods. They're very popular, if you will, but then Jews from Iconium and Antioch came to Lystra and stirred up trouble. Verse 19, but the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. And so the very crowd that on one day wanted to worship Paul and Barnabas as gods because of the healing of that lame man, sometime later were manipulated by those who had opposed Paul and Barnabas previously. They stirred them up with anger to the point that the crowd stoned Paul outside the city, thought he was dead. And again, how easy it is to manipulate a crowd, to stir up a crowd with negativity, with anger, with hatred, with lies. Crowds can be very fickle. And as a warning to me and a warning to you, be very careful when movements or groups in this culture try to stir you up with anger, stir you up with hatred, because your common sense, your logic, your ability to think rationally and reasonably often go out the window, and your emotions take over, and you become blinded. Crowds can be fickle, so be careful you don't get caught up in the hateful, negative, angry, fickle crowds of today, whether it's in politics or anything else. You might just find yourself on the wrong side of what God is actually doing. Be careful. Be careful. Now, how did Paul and Barnabas respond to all this? Well, we saw earlier in Iconium, they kept preaching the gospel. Here it's very interesting in verse 20. While the disciples stood around him, he got up. Paul got up. So he wasn't dead. He rose up. God healed him, and he entered the city. He goes into the same city where they had just stoned him. And I'm confident when he went in that city, he walked around, they saw he was alive, and he kept talking about Jesus. And then the next day, they go on to Derbe. But everywhere they went, they kept preaching the gospel. So, in our culture, we at times will face opposition, hostility to the gospel, to the Christian faith, to the truth of God's word. Let me just say something. Do not allow opposition to the gospel, opposition to God, to keep you from sharing the gospel. Don't allow it to intimidate you into silence. Don't allow opposition, negativity, and all that stuff out there to make you bitter and angry. Because when you allow it to make you bitter and angry, the devil has already won. Don't allow it to cause you to live in fear, to give up hope. Don't allow it to cause you to become so focused on fighting the battle of the day that you end up being distracted from the eternal battle of sharing the gospel to keep people out of an eternal hell. See, I think Satan is happy when we spend all of our energy fighting cultural battles and don't have much left over to battle for lost souls. I think it's a tactic of hell. Be careful. And that's the word for today. Do what Paul and Barnabas did. Stay focused on the gospel. Stay focused on the gospel. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 15.